Hello everyone, today we talk about the Knight Hospitalier's equipment in the first centuries of his existence, namely the ones of the Outremer Crusades. And albeit this is a historical military unit series video, we will not cover specifically the Hospitalier armament, given that the apological evolution of 200 years would require at least some digression on. It's not a radical change, as you know, but given that in this series we cover specific examples in important chronological detail, this one will be instead dedicated to the Hospitalier's uniform fundamentally and its changes over time. This partly has to do with the broader issue of the gradual homogenization, also military appearance over the high and late Middle Ages. Given that the order's regulations are also providing with significant details about this, and you know that the Knights Hospitalier, St. John, later of Rhodes, and later even of Malta, etc., would have an important military history, which I hope to cover, in fact, in detail, step by step. This is just about the broader clothing, right? So how would a Hospitalier knight essentially differentiate himself from other Crusader knights? And you know that the origins are also kind of blended, because the order was established as an assistance brotherhood even before the beginning of the First Crusade. So the Middle Ages was actually full of these various confraternities that eventually evolved also quite autonomously in what we know, at least in this case, monastic military orders to core, and even in important powers in the medieval and modern age, especially the latter in this case. But at the beginning, there was really no broader differentiation, especially within the context of a crusade, between them, let's say, in outlook, in appearance, in term badges of recognition, than basically all the other crusaders, right? And there is some distinction to make, because of course there was not, together with, in fact, uniformity, not even a general regulation about what kind of other symbols were to be worn. Crusaders, as you know, mostly had a crude cross depicted on their shields, sometimes even their helmets, definitely their surcoat. As a point, it's an easy symbol to draw. There is nothing specific about that within the broader Christian dimension of a crusading army. But these orders, at some point, as they grew more powerful, better organized, and also presenting a formidable military elite within the Outremer states, and not only, also at home, they began to regulate their appearance as well, which was kind of in part the last of their concern compared to the broader moral fitness and standards. But as we, as monks and as warriors, naturally, but as we often say when talking about this aspects of military, of early military uniformity, etc., there was also a moral dimension to uniformation, to this kind of regulation, because this sense of belonging, this esprit de corps, and the broader devotion and even fanatism was necessary to achieve the extraordinary military standards that these knights, that for the rest were equipped just like all the others. So as always, and in Clausewitzian terms, it's moral forces that make the greatest difference in war, were influenced by such badges, by such devices. Right? So if we were to look at the first indicator, this guy's in Hospitalier, right? Say the 12th century, the mid 12th century. Well, this is the voluminous enveloping mantle known as kappa, worn over the armor on active service. And the main problem with this initially is that it seems to have impeded often the wearer in battle by a certain degree, which is a concept which makes you think, why would have they worn it in the first place at that point? Well, of course, we were not there to see how the thing normally unfolded. Mantles were worn for many reasons, including the most banal thermic excursions, especially in areas like the Near East, etc. As you know, wool can isolate, right? If you wear wool in the desert, actually it keeps you fresh compared to the outer heat, because the body temperature is lower. The same goes for night, where things can go really down in terms of temperature. In any case, so these people would at some point even have hardly the opportunity of getting rid of their equipment, not just their mantle, as we will see, but also other material that was needed, even just for, I don't know, dressing wounds and other, just think about water. There was a specific regulation even when these people could drink, because at least in when they were drawn up in battle formation, they couldn't abandon their lines, and they would have been severely sanctioned, which is something that especially these military orders were kind of much more in fact disciplined about than the other crusaders. And very often, as you know, the crusader states also entrusted the Templars, the Hospitallers, etc., some functions of command over the other crusaders because of these military standards that they owned. So they had also to cope with problems of general discipline for troopers that were not part of their order. In any case, aside, so we don't talk really about armor, but the equipment at this point was pretty standard. There's a coat of mail and then an acton worn underneath, sometimes even over. As we will see, there is some padding or the surcoat at a point even over the ober, and then a linen tunic, some leather shoes, and a different degree of armor for the limbs that increase over time, with covering the van braces gradually. Also with the shows, the legs, etc. There is a hemming of equipment. In the mid 13th century, you have plate armor spreading, right, mostly from the torso, then coming to envelope other parts of the body towards the end of the century. But there we stop. By the mid 12th century, a half-length hauberk and hacketon sleeve would essentially bulge the shape of the black kappa around the elbows. Consider that in the Near East as well, the idea of wearing lighter armor because of the more exhausting climatic situation, especially for somebody having to fight under the sun, covered in all this equipment, would bring to a lightening of the armor, especially, and this, as we have explained many times, the kappa in this case, and together with the acton and the oberk, would tend to form an unicum, right? We don't have to think of the equipment as just a sum of kind of almost wargamistic interchangeable things just per se. Right? Of course they were, and there was a great deal of personalization, but this happened also by trying to provide a functional unit, not just ergonomically speaking, for physically for combat, etc., but also visually, right? And in a general, as if it were a sort of uniform, right? Today we don't even digress on the concept of uniform that is relative, can be used in many ways. Of course, as this video also demonstrates, there were some standards of uniformity also during the Middle Ages, right? It's nothing to be strange. It's not just a modern thing, as modernists would like to make you believe. It always existed by a certain degree. already at this time you can in fact see on the monk's black kappa a simple cross sewn to the breast. From the Hospitaller statute of 1206 we have a very interesting clothing allocation for the single knight, which says 3 pairs of white linen or cotton breeches, 3 white linen or cotton shirt, 3 linen cotta, 2 pairs, 1 linen, 1 wool white hose, 1 cotton coif, 1 white cap, probably of felt, 1 black woolen gamache and hood, 1 black woolen mantle lined with fur for winter, 1 black woolen mantle unlined for summer, 4 white linen bedding sheets, and 1 linen bag for bedding. Right. So, in theory, the knight had to have at all useful time, say, this kind of equipment ready, and or let's say maybe not necessarily on every single occasion, especially in campaign, in battle, physically with him, right? But consider that these were knights, so they had a retinue, there were also the sergeant of the order, etc. But ideally, this was the spare, the worn and plus the spare equipment that properly of clothing that the Hospitaller knight had to wear at all times. Towards the 13th century, things start to evolve a little, including for the fact that a 1248 papal bull finally authorized the adoption of a white, so-called white cross-embroidered black surcoat, quote, as a remedy for the fact that when you are wearing the cappa clausa, so the closed mantle over your armor, which hampers both your hands and your arms, it makes it easier for your enemies to attack you and harder for you to defend yourself, right? In fact, this kappa must have originally been difficult to use in combat, albeit consider that in duels also a mantle can do something in terms of confusing the enemy, blinding him, or having this degree of concealing effect also for your own weapon at some point. But we have to presume that within the order, the Hospitaller had already adopted a black surcoat that we will see also will change color in a couple of decades for the more typical red one, for which in fact the Knights of Malta just also their flag is made like with the 8-pointed star, white star, and this change was kind of in line also with the broader development of knightly clothing at that point, and the uniformation in this sense toward that era does reflect, in fact, the one that was occurring together also with professionalization, with the probably the development of the hierarchical system of these brotherhoods as well, and the internal segmentation also from a tactical point of view, the greater functionalization. So this was kind of normal, right? The idea of wearing the mantle that could even hamper your movement was just also it's ridiculous conceptually, because of course they wouldn't wear something that would actually create them a problem, but let's say that it would be used as an explanation also in the papal bull to say, okay, you have to be more functionalized in equipment for combat at all times, right? Given that this had become the main purpose of the order, and so its members were not just random pilgrim monks, right? That could just also have this kind of less military, more civilian, even though there was not really a difference in those times, categorical clothing. you have to wear that at all time, like as a properly form of badge. Let's say that the latter types of heavy woolen kappas that were developed in decades before the mid 13th century were probably this large and broad hood with long sleeves, right, with no slits in the hem. Still, there was the new style of cross was probably already sewn on the front, and the kappa was tied around the waist with a white rope, and the long sleeves of the kappa could be partially rolled back in the process as well. Considering that the early 13th century is also the time of important increase in knightly and also horse equipment. So first of all, the gambesons, as we've seen, could be worn also just beneath the kappa and over the hauberk, right? This would also probably functionalize further the kappa for that specific interaction with the armor. And the broadered knight's horse would be covered by a kilted caparison as well. That is a very debated topic in of itself, because we don't get an overwhelming amount of visual evidence for it. The 13th century is also the moment in which properly horse mail armor appears, right, even completely in the ultra heavy elite cavalry that constituted just a very, very, very tiny part of any army's mounted forces. But sometimes from iconography we don't understand whether what is depicted is mail, leather, or just a padded armor. Now, the latter, which was instead quite common, it was practically worn by all knights, especially in these centuries. Whereas for the horses, we don't see that as much, but it's likely that, especially in the Near East, but this is maybe just stressing it too much, but the amount of arrows that normally hailed the horsemen were quite dangerous for the animal, right? It is quite resilient, but also quite delicate. It can be crippled very, very easily, and that it's not much just for the individual horse, but when you have to carry out an orderly charge where the cohesion of the line must be kept to the last meters to have the full effect. Let's say in a broader system, the more you shoot at the horses and the more you mess up the entire system. But let's say, considering the spread of crossbow in Western Europe at this time and incredible firepower, probably the Western horsemen were just providing their mounts with extensive amount of this padded clothing and padded armor, and we don't just know the ratio really, as we have seen also recently the other day in that video about the Western European knight, the 12th century, that fits, generally speaking, the one of the first part of this video's period, the Aquitaine or Gambeson. There is a subtle difference between the two by some degree. However, padded armor was dramatically effective against most blows that arrived not at a perfectly straight angle, and or having much of their force spent in the, especially as projectiles in the flight, etc. And thus this was actually a very effective in terms of cost benefit compared especially to metal armor, right? Type of armor would be quite important, not as effective like mail, but still. And at this point also metal armor was spread. In fact, normally also the horse head was protected by a chamfron, right? And consider we're talking here about hospitaller knights, so these were still the heavy cavalry, so these were the most likely to have adopted kind of armor for the horses too. On this comparison, you could have seen probably some devices, as you will see now, also heraldic ones in parallel to the hospitalier symbols. There was also a small heraldic escutcheon on the saddle, typically, which was allowed at this time. And this is in fact an important aspect of the story. There's an important degree of uniformation, as we've seen towards in the beginning, the third quarter of the 13th century, as the surcoats of brother knights were changed to red, or the most typical red, from black to red, in 1259. It's probable that black and red was still worn contemporarily at some point, and that red had already spread, given that there was no particular uniformity. And as we've seen, even gambesons were often colored, and these were also to be impregnated with blood as organic material. So red was a common color that could help also for properly the surcoats, etc., that are spreading at the same time. So the fact it was changed to red, of course, okay, the other color was black, so you won't see much blood on that too, but still there was probably some other symbolic reason for this. And the order's white cross was still sewn upon the surcoats, right, that maintained. As we've seen, the 8-pointed star was adopted fundamentally at this time, and the wearing of red surcoats was extended to brother sergeants from 1278. I would like to point out that we will hopefully make videos about the hospitaller military organization, training, tactics, and so on. They were pretty standard for medieval warfare at the time, but very often in monastic military orders, as you know, the Templars and hospitaller statutes provide with some of the most complete and also, in fact, effective regulation for feudal warfare, right? Cavalry tactics, especially. Hospitaller donats were the uniform of brother knights as well. Speaking of shields and the evolution of devices here, that is very interesting because of the mix of also with some lay simple, if we can call it in this way. We don't really know much regarding the early days. Say, hospitaller shields were probably decorated by a cross, right? This was normal painted cross, and everything was relatively undecorated, right? Including the sword, the scabbard, horse harness, that were all instead very often elaborated in kind of more lay background and context. These were monks. They had to display this material poverty that would have had to reflect in turn instead the strength of the spirit. It was quite useful conceptually because it exalted the idea of self-sacrifice, and you know that conceptually these monastic orders were conceived with providing with warriors that would have literally had to take out tens of people before being killed themselves, ideally, and actually they were quite cold-blooded and disciplined, but as you know, there are also some instances in which that dramatic force was unleashed all at once with devastating effects, and most of the times, in case of, however, defeat, also with significant losses according. But that was the point, right? Full charge and energy investment, because that's objectively a classical principle of war, right? If you manage to deliver that force all at once, which these men were trained for in a lifetime of sacrifice, really you can achieve some of the greatest epics. As you know, the crusading army's elite was constituted by the monastic military orders knights. So this was the ideal of simplicity, aesthetically, that the Hospitallers attempted to maintain for several centuries. Say to maintain because, of course, these men were also of different extraction. It was all a selection process, but very often they were also coming from important nobiliar families, and so they had all an ethos and a pride, and still, especially in the early centuries, an important individualism. It was also displayed figuratively, because at the beginning, uniformity was not even required. These were people freely joining the order, of course, making an oath, and from that point onwards, entering a new life. So they were under strict discipline, etc., but still maintaining an individual characteristic, right? And knights, in their individual overload of ultra professionalism, etc., were just unique types, each on their own, right? The Hospitallers apparently only universally adopted the red shield with a white cross under the Grand Master Nicolas de Lorgne between 1277 and 1285. As you know, this man came from all over Europe. There is also a map here, Western Europe, Western Christendom, of course. And unlike the Templars, there is a fair chance that at least at some late 12th and 13th century Hospitallers, probably the senior officers, bore their own coats of arms on their shields, right? Or so we should assume from 13th century Hospitaller legislation repeatedly, and thus apparently unsuccessfully, forbidding the decoration of arms and equipment, which was, again, otherwise kind of normal, right? Because it was still an honor to have certain individuals within the order, and the same Grand Masters, as you know, but this goes straight to, I don't know, even the popes had their own familiar coat of arms displayed in the official, integrated properly in the official current symbology of the office, right? So it was normal, generally speaking, but these were, in fact, the orders where such behavior was considered for spiritual reasons, kind of more importantly, problematic. And so to regulate, right? And it's very meaningful because it was a military order. So even certain, let's say, licenses that could be taken, as we've seen also, the office of the papacy, right? In a world where, in order to be a killing machine, because that's purely what the military must be for any kind of effectiveness, you cannot afford to reason as an individual human being, right? Of course, the world was kind of more modern and secularized from the times of the ancient comitatus and so on, but these were essentially military brotherhoods evolving from the one of the migration era and even way before. And so the idea that you didn't properly belong to the world anymore, which is present, in fact, also in the Christian ideology, and as you were just like another person and completely devoted to your duty, that was also, and we know from their lifestyle, was pretty rigid, was crucial in providing that esprit de corps, that motivation, that mindset that would make you, again, charge in the fray, outnumbered, and just, butchering people without blinking an eye, right? And that is the hardcore, arguably the sole concept behind this all, right? Because these people were dramatically skilled in that job. If you don't have a motivation, you cannot do that, simply, right? Never underestimate human intelligence and moral forces, because without those you can't practically do anything. That's what we have individually become, right? But these men were just something else. Considered many of them were also professional knights from a lay military career, right? So they already knew how to perform. There are many interesting examples. I also made last autumn a similar video regarding the Knight Templar, and there are some anecdotes there about some individuals, the reasons why they would want to become military monks. Very linear ones. It was typical, actually, of many knights, military commanders, and or when they, I don't know, their wives died, they were ahead in age. They said, you know what, I just want to isolate myself. I want to prepare myself to the spiritually, to the end, to the afterlife, to concentrate myself, to also redeem myself from my sins. Because again, people that normally, cut human beings to pieces since their early youth as a living, frankly, were, as we have explained, in what being a medieval knight in training really meant. Just in training, not even properly what they did. That was enough, because otherwise you couldn't do the rest, right? Is psychologically very interesting. I mean, from one side, it's something that you wouldn't like to know, but at the same time, you cannot understand really medieval warfare otherwise, and also much of the other historical one for that matter. So, and it's obvious that the more you legislate about something, it's the more you show that that specific problem is there in a way or another. So the reiteration especially tells us that many knights would like still to bear their own personal arms next to the one of the order. And in fact, we know, as we were saying before, for the Grand Masters, that by the middle to late 14th century, they often quartered their personal arms with the arms of the order as well, right? But that was kind of at least understood as more institutional, but still, as a leading example, it tells you that still it was considered very, very important. Consider that by the 70s of the 13th century, the Pope permitted hospitaliers also to use different colored sword coats to distinguish broader knights from broader sergeants. That is becoming really important, as these are the years in which literally the knight is becoming ultra heavy by certain previous standards, and tactical interaction in combined arms is ever more important. So distinguishing on the battlefield the various units, various specializations. As you know, normally even from the various companies, these the knights all fought in a battle line. Then the infantry, maybe some of also the retinues that accompanied them, was arrayed all together as well. So it was important to distinguish them. This tells you also that, of course, many broader sergeants would fight on horseback, and there is partly also a status reason, because cavalry from one side, yes, was also specializing in this kind of lighter missile role, ever more distinguished from the one of the ultra heavy one. But it was probably a matter of status, for which we see in the 13th century squires, as we knew them in previous centuries, practically disappear, because even lesser people began to let's say to be able to afford the nightly panoply, the full nightly panoply. So it would become difficult to also distinguish them from the others. But this is just like a combination just for the hospitaliers, where things were probably already much more regulated. In part, probably things were also more egalitarian. So this may be part of the reason why, because consider that there were also sort of camaraderie, depending on also from the close proximity of other specific individuals that still formed different bonds within the broader group, as always, etc. In any case, there were also interesting versions of the uniform. Let's say, for example, kilted ones with short sleeves, probably known as a jupel, the zuppa, right? And specifically to this Italian influence terms, consider by the end of the 13th century, beginning of 14th, first of all, the red circlet or partially padded jupon was worn by all hospitaller brethren at arms, right? And the strong Italian influence in armor that today we do not discuss, as we just said before, but was influenced the Japan itself, various weaponry, etc., reflects the general dominance of material culture that Italians had always maintained in the Mediterranean from the 11th century onwards, and their habitual context and presence actually within the Near East, especially with Egypt, Syria, Palestine, etc., because the Italians were there before and after the Crusades continuously with their port colonies, etc. And they provided, as you know, I made a video about this, with largely with the material and just some of the most updated, in fact, material culture, including the one of weaponry, and Italian panoply also had very interesting adaptations at this time, including some interesting combinations of cuir bouillie with metal, etc., that also become ever more agronomic, and also more, of course, in terms of heavier equipment. But the presence of Italians, of Germans, there are a lot of Germans as well, French also that dominated, the English, the Spanish, etc. All reflects the evolution, also in the influence in the orders, the reflection of the broader technological advancements of the military culture of the time, that the West was being fundamentally pioneered. And that in this broader era, albeit Acre, as you know, was lost in 1291. So initially, the Knights had Rhodes as their base, also Cyprus, eventually Malta, as you know, historically. But they still were pretty close to essentially Italian Greece. As you know, the entire maritime area was seized by the Venetians, the Genoese at the same time, so the connection with Europe was mostly owed to them. So that's why this influence also in the terminology and the equipment, etc., from the Italian peninsula. Speaking of a more kind of non-military context, there was a practice that strictly regulated by the Hospitaller statutes regarding not carrying arms or wearing armor in chapter, right, during the meetings taking place there, presumably to avoid intimidation, right? So, as you know, as we were saying before, these knights were often proud of their power. They often were ferocious interests within the same order and general disputes for political, strategical reasons, etc. So the idea that these were, as we've seen, killing machines, and they could get heated and or however in disagreement in certain situations. The regulation was at that point in these meetings you didn't have to wear any nor arms or armor. So the idea is that you are properly deprived of any essentially lethal mean of offense, and this was of course valid also for other offices. There were other, for the sergeants, etc. But what is important to stress is also the hospitaller had also a retinue. Very often, the same doctors think this had been born as a hospital, but these orders also for the Templars, they didn't really develop much of other functions within. They preferred to hire local personnel, right, professionals, etc. And the same goes for the field aides. There were something else, etc. So they could just afford that. They were quite rich and powerful, but they were an order, right? So as many monastic institutions, also in the Teutonic order, that was an excellent example of a central state for medieval standards, differently from the lay ones that were all kind of private, kind of messy, but they had a more rigid hierarchy, right? As a monastic institution where nobody inherited anything, etc. So there was a much greater and better functionality within its administration, its policy, etc., than other systems. So that's also part which the fortune of the military orders stems from. So as I was saying before, I will hopefully talk about the hospitallers. We've met them here and there during some crusading era battles that we discussed. As you know, if you're interested, I have plenty of playlists for everything. Just search for Crusades and you will find what you need. And for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.